The 11th of January 1944, 32,000 feet above the frozen fields of Thuringia. The air is thin and bitter. At this altitude, frost clings to the inside of cockpit canopies like skeletal fingers. The temperature sits at 40 degrees below zero. Each breath drawn through an oxygen mask burns the lungs. Below, the German countryside unfolds in shades of white and grey, a colourless tapestry of snow-covered farmland, dark forests, and the occasional curl of smoke rising from villages that seem impossibly distant, impossibly small. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler sits cramped in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, his leather gloves stiff with cold despite their wool lining. He has been flying intercept missions for nearly 3 years. He knows the rhythm of these encounters by heart. The alarm sounds at the airfield, the scramble, the climb through layers of cloud, the radio chatter growing tense as ground control vectors them toward the incoming formation, and then always the moment when the American bombers appear on the horizon. They come in boxes, hundreds of them, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators arranged in tight combat formations, their silver bodies glinting like scales on some immense mechanical serpent stretching across the winter sky. Stigler has learned to read these formations the way a hunter reads tracks in snow. He knows where the weak points are, the stragglers with smoking engines, the aircraft that have already taken flak damage over the target, the young pilots who break formation too early or too late. Today should be no different. His wingman's voice crackles through the radio. They are closing to attack range. Stigler adjusts his grip on the control stick, checks his ammunition count, begins the mental preparation for combat. In these moments, everything else falls away. There is only the mathematics of deflection angles, the ballet of energy management, the cold calculus of who will live and who will die in the next 3 minutes. But then he sees them. At first, he thinks his vision is playing tricks. The altitude, the cold, the strain of too many missions with too little rest, all of these can create ghosts in the sky. But the radio chatter tells him his eyes are not deceiving him. Other pilots are seeing it too. The voices carry notes of disbelief, then confusion, then something that sounds uncomfortably close to fear. The American bombers are not alone. Surrounding them, weaving through the bomber formations with an ease that seems almost casual, are single-engine fighters. Sleek, angular, painted in the olive, drab and grey of the United States Army Air Forces. They are far from their bases in England. They are deep, impossibly deep into German airspace. And they are still there, still flying, still escorting the bombers all the way to the target and beyond. Stigler knows the shape of these aircraft. He has seen them before in intelligence briefings, in gun camera footage, in hurried conversations between pilots at the officers' mess. North American P-51 Mustangs. But until this moment, they have been a theoretical threat, a distant concern. The numbers said they did not have the range. The maps said they could not reach this far. The operational certainty of the Luftwaffe command structure said that somewhere over Belgium, somewhere short of the Rhine, these escort fighters would have to turn back, their fuel tanks empty, leaving the bombers naked for the killing. The numbers were wrong. To understand the shock that ripples through Franz Stigler and every other German pilot flying that day, one must step backward in time, backward into the strategic doctrine that has governed air warfare since the earliest days of the conflict. When war came to Europe in September 1939, the principles of strategic bombing were still being written, tested, and revised in the blood of aircrews. The Germans had demonstrated in Spain and Poland that aircraft could be decisive weapons, but they had designed their Luftwaffe primarily as a tactical force, a flying artillery meant to support ground operations. The heavy 4-engine bombers that could strike deep into enemy territory, independent of army movements, were a concept the Germans had explored but never fully committed to. The British and Americans, by contrast, had embraced this concept with almost religious fervour. They believed, rightly or wrongly, that strategic bombing could break the industrial capacity and civilian morale of an enemy nation. That cities could be set aflame, factories reduced to rubble, and entire populations forced to bend under the weight of high explosive and incendiary. The bomber, they proclaimed, would always get through. But proclamations made in conference rooms do not survive contact with reality. By 1943, the Allied bomber offensive against Germany had become a grinding campaign of attrition that was bleeding the 8th Air Force white. The B-17 Seconds and B-24 Seconds flew out each morning from their bases in England, crossing the North Sea and the Low Countries, penetrating into the heart of the Reich to drop their bombs on oil refineries, aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, and rail yards, and each day fewer of them came home. The Luftwaffe had learned how to kill them. German day fighters, the Bf 109 Seconds and Focke-Wulf of W190 Seconds, would wait beyond the range of the short-legged Allied escort fighters, wait until the Spitfires and Thunderbolts reached their fuel limits and turned back toward England. Then they would swarm. They would attack from head-on, closing at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, firing their 20mm and 30mm cannons into the formations. They would attack from below, climbing through the bomber boxes with rocket tubes strapped beneath their wings, each R4M rocket capable of tearing the wing off a B-17. They would press their attacks with fanatical courage, born from the knowledge that the factories being bombed today produced the ammunition for tomorrow, that the cities burning below were their own. The loss rates became unsustainable. On some missions, 1 in 10 bombers failed to return. On the 14th of October 1943, a day that would be remembered as Black Thursday, 291, B-17 Seconds attacked ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. 60 were shot down. Another 17 were so badly damaged they would never fly again. More than 600 American airmen were dead, wounded, or missing. The 8th Air Force had proven, bloodily and conclusively, that the bomber would not always get through, not without escort. But escort required range, and range was determined by fuel capacity, engine efficiency, and aerodynamic design. The early American escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, were formidable machines, but they were limited. Even with drop tanks, they could not accompany the bombers all the way to Berlin, all the way to Munich, all the way to the targets deep in southern Germany that needed to be destroyed if the Reich's war machine was to be broken. The Germans knew this. They had calculated the radius of action for every Allied fighter type. They had marked the maps with range circles showing where the escorts would turn back. They had planned their intercept zones accordingly. For 18 months, this mathematics of death had held true. The bomber stream would cross into Germany protected. Then, at a predictable point, the protection would evaporate, and the killing would begin. Until January 1944. Until the arrival of the Mustang. The P-51 was not supposed to be an American aircraft at all. It had been designed in 1940 at the urgent request of the British, who desperately needed fighters and could not wait for existing American types to be adapted to their needs. North American Aviation, a company that had never built a fighter aircraft before, promised to deliver a prototype in an impossible time frame, 120 days. They kept their promise. The early Mustangs were fast and long-legged, but their Allison engines gasped for air at high altitude, leaving them outclassed by German fighters above 20,000 feet. The British used them for low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack. The Americans showed limited interest. But someone in the British Air Ministry had an idea. What if the American airframe was mated with the British engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same power plant that had carried Spitfires to victory in the Battle of Britain? What if that elegant laminar flow wing, that clean aerodynamic fuselage, could be matched with an engine designed specifically for high-altitude performance? The marriage of American engineering and British ingenuity produced something extraordinary. The P-51B, the Merlin-powered variant, could fly faster, climb higher, and reach farther than any fighter on either side of the war. With external drop tanks, it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a round trip of more than 1,000 miles. It could do this while carrying 6 50-caliber machine guns, enough firepower to shred any German fighter foolish enough to challenge it. and it could do this while still retaining enough speed and agility to win dogfights against the best pilots the Luftwaffe could throw into the sky. The mathematics of death had changed. The first P-51B groups began arriving in England in late 1943. By January 1944, they were operational. And when the bomber missions pushed deep into Germany that winter, the German pilots finally encountered what they had been told was impossible. Franz Stigler watches the Mustangs weave through the bomber formation and knows immediately that the old tactics will not work. Before, the German fighters had enjoyed a crucial advantage: time. Once the short-ranged escorts turned back, the Luftwaffe could stalk the bomber stream for hundreds of miles, setting up coordinated attacks, reforming after each pass, choosing the moment and angle of engagement. They could attack, disengage, refuel, and attack again. The bombers were trapped in their formations, plodding forward at 180 miles per hour, unable to maneuver, unable to flee. Their only defense, the interlocking fields of fire from their 50 caliber turrets. But now the escorts are still here, still fresh, still dangerous. Stigler knows what will happen if he presses an attack. The moment he commits to a firing pass on a bomber, one of those Mustangs will see him. It will dive from above or climb from below or simply turn inside his arc of maneuver, and in 3 seconds, perhaps 4, he will have tracers walking up his fuselage. The P-51 is faster in level flight than his Bf-109. It is faster in a dive. It handles better at high altitude. The only advantage his aircraft retains is a slightly tighter turn radius at low speeds, and low speeds are where pilots die. The radio chatter reflects the same calculations happening in a dozen other cockpits. The attack is fragmenting before it begins. Some pilots are aborting, diving away toward cloud cover. Others are trying to lure the Mustangs away from the bombers, hoping to create an opening. A few the veterans, the holders of the Knight's Cross, the men with 50 or 60 kills who remember when the Luftwaffe owned the sky, are pressing their attacks anyway, accepting the odds, trusting their skill. Stigler watches one of them die. The Focke-Wulf comes in from 11 o'clock high, nose glowing with cannon fire, shells stitching across the wing of a B-17. It is a good attack, perfectly executed. But before the German pilot can break away, a Mustang materializes on his tail. The geometry is brutal and final. The American pilot does not need deflection shooting or fancy aerobatics. He simply puts his nose on the Focke-Wulf and holds the trigger. The 50 caliber rounds, each one nearly as long as a man's hand, saw through the German fighter's empennage. The tail section separates. The aircraft tumbles into an inverted spin. Stigler does not see a parachute. He makes his decision. He pulls his stick back, rolls inverted, and dives away. It is not cowardice. It is survival. There will be other missions, other opportunities. The young pilots, fresh from training, might throw themselves into suicidal attacks, driven by propaganda and desperation. But the veterans know that a dead pilot wins no victories. Better to return to base, refuel, and wait for a moment when the odds are less catastrophically unfavorable. As he dives through 12,000 feet, Stigler catches one last glimpse of the bomber stream. It is still intact, still flying eastward toward whatever target intelligence has selected for today, and it is still surrounded by those sleek, shark-like escorts. For the first time since 1940, Franz Stigler wonders if Germany can win this war. The presence of long-range escorts transformed the strategic bombing campaign in ways that extended far beyond the tactical mathematics of fighter combat. Psychologically, it inverted the emotional dynamic of the air war. German pilots had spent years as hunters. They had climbed into their cockpits each morning knowing that somewhere ahead, vulnerable and slow, a formation of bombers would be waiting. The hunt was dangerous. American gunners were skilled and brave, and the 50 caliber machine gun was a fearsome weapon. But it was still a hunt. The predator chose the moment. The predator controlled the engagement. Now they were prey. Every mission became a calculation of risk that tilted toward the unbearable. Attack the bombers and accept that you would probably be attacked in turn by escorts with superior performance. Engage the escorts and burn through your fuel without accomplishing the mission of stopping the bombers. Refuse combat and face court-martial for cowardice. There were no good options, only gradations of bad ones. The loss rates reflected this new reality. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 1,311 pilots killed, wounded, or missing. In February, the number climbed to 1,452. These were not simply statistics. These were experienced fighter pilots, men who had survived the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, the Mediterranean men whose skill and knowledge could not be replaced by the teenagers now being rushed through abbreviated training programs. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out, and the infusion of long-range American escorts was the blade that had opened the artery. For the American bomber crews, the change was nothing short of miraculous. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the B-17 Memphis Belle, described the first time he saw P-51 seconds escorting his formation all the way to the target and back. We couldn't believe it. We kept waiting for them to turn around, kept expecting to see them peel off and head for home, but they stayed with us. Mile after mile, they stayed with us. When we saw them still there over the target, some of the guys actually cried. The numbers bear witness to this transformation. In October 1943, before the arrival of the P-51, the 8th Air Force lost 9.2% of dispatched bombers per mission. By May 1944, with Mustang groups operational across the theatre, that figure had dropped to 3.5%. Hundreds of aircraft were saved. Thousands of lives were preserved. The strategic bombing campaign, which had been on the verge of collapse in late 1943, became sustainable. But there was a deeper psychological shift occurring, one that extended beyond survival rates and loss statistics. The German pilots had expected to face enemies. They had not expected to face an industrial and technological system so vast, so adaptive, so overwhelmingly resourceful that it could simply engineer solutions to problems that seemed insurmountable. The P-51 was not a miracle. It was the product of specific design choices, metallurgical advances, and production techniques. It was the manifestation of an economy that could afford to experiment, to iterate, to discard failures and scale successes. Every time a German pilot looked up and saw those Mustangs still flying Escort deep over Berlin, he was looking at a message written in aluminum and aviation fuel. We can outproduce you. We can out-innovate you. We can solve problems faster than you can create them. This was the quiet terror that began to eat at German morale more effectively than any propaganda leaflet. The symbolic weight of the P-51 extended beyond its tactical role. If one were to choose an object that embodied the American approach to this war, an approach fundamentally different from the German or Japanese understanding of martial virtue, it would not be a weapon of overwhelming firepower or brutal simplicity. It would be the drop tank. The drop tank was an ungainly thing, a teardrop-shaped container of pressed paper or light metal slung beneath the wings or fuselage of a fighter aircraft filled with gasoline. It had no elegance. It added drag and reduced performance. It was disposable by design, jettisoned once empty or when combat loomed. In the hierarchy of military equipment, it ranked somewhere below a mess kit, but it changed everything. The drop tank represented a philosophy, that logistics matter more than courage, that range matters more than dogfighting prowess, that the ability to be present where you are needed matters more than being the fastest or the most heavily armed. It was an admission that wars are not won by heroes alone, but by supply chains, by fuel depots, by engineers who solve the unglamorous problem of how to carry more gasoline without the aircraft tearing itself apart on takeoff. German fighter design philosophy had prioritized climb rate, firepower, and sustained turn performance. These were the attributes of a defensive air force, an air force designed to intercept bombers over its own territory, to fight short, violent engagements within gliding distance of friendly airfields. The concept of flying a single-engine fighter 1,000 miles from base loitering over enemy territory for 30 minutes, and then flying 1,000 miles home was alien to this philosophy. The Americans and British had embraced it completely. They had built not just the aircraft but the entire logistical infrastructure required to make long-range escort viable. Fuel depots in England stockpiled the 100-octane gasoline that the Merlin engine demanded. Factories in the United States produced the drop tanks by the tens of thousands, cheap, expendable, scattered across half of Europe as the fighters jettisoned them before combat. Maintenance crews worked through the night to keep the Mustangs flying, replacing engines, repairing battle damage, tweaking systems. The P-51 was not simply a fighter. It was the tip of a spear whose shaft stretched back across the Atlantic, back through the factories of Detroit and Los Angeles, back through the oil fields of Texas and the training bases of Arizona. It was a weapon system in the truest sense, not just the machine, but the entire industrial and human network required to put that machine over Berlin. And the German pilots, watching those silver specks weave through the bomber formations at altitudes where the air was too thin to breathe, understood this. They understood that they were not simply fighting other pilots, they were fighting an economic system, and that was a fight they could not win. By the spring of 1944, the presence of long-range escorts had become routine, and routine had bred a grim new phase of the air war. The Germans adapted. They always adapted. When the old tactics failed, they developed new ones. They began attacking the bomber formations during the brief windows when the escorts were refueling or switching out, the gaps in coverage that still existed. They employed faster aircraft, the W-190D, the Me-262 jet in limited numbers that could exploit speed advantages even against the Mustang. They armed some fighters with heavy cannons and rockets, accepting reduced maneuverability in exchange for the ability to destroy a bomber with a single hit, hoping to get off one lethal shot before the escorts arrived. But these were expedients, tactical adjustments made by a force that no longer controlled the initiative. The real war, the war that mattered, was being won by the bombers that the escorts protected. Through the spring and summer of 1944, as Allied armies prepared for the invasion of France, the 8th Air Force and Royal Air Force Bomber Command systematically dismantled the German war economy. Oil refineries burned. Rail yards were cratered. Aircraft factories were reduced to skeletal frameworks of twisted girders. And because the escorts were there, because the bombers could reach their targets and return home, the campaign was cumulative. Each mission built on the last. Damage was not repaired before the next raid arrived. Franz Stigler flew through all of this. He survived, through skill and luck, through the calculus of when to fight and when to flee. He watched his squadron shrink, new pilots arriving from training schools with 30 hours in type, shot down on their second or third mission. He watched the quality of fuel decline as Germany's synthetic oil plants were destroyed, the engines in his Bf-109 beginning to cough and stumble. He watched the rations get smaller, the replacement parts get scarcer, the promises of wonder weapons grow more desperate and hollow. In May 1945, when Germany surrendered, Franz Stigler was alive. Many were not. Of the pilots who had flown with him in January 1944, fewer than 1 in 5 survived the war. After the war, Stigler emigrated to Canada. He did not speak much about his service. He became a businessman, raised a family, tried to build a life in a world that had moved on from the frozen skies over Thuringia. But in the late 1982, he read a story in a magazine, a story written by an American bomber pilot named Charles Brown, who described being escorted to safety by a German fighter pilot who could have shot him down but chose mercy instead. Stigler recognized the details, recognized the date, recognized the act that he had nearly forgotten. He reached out. The two men met. They became friends, these former enemies, bound together by a moment of humanity in a war that had offered so few of them. They appeared together at reunions, gave interviews together, tried to explain to a generation that had not lived through it what it had been like in those skies. When asked about the moment he first saw the P-51 seconds escorting bombers deep into Germany, Stigler paused for a long time before answering. "I knew," he finally said, "that we had already lost. We just didn't know how to stop fighting." The story of the P-51 Mustang and the German pilots who faced it is not a story about aircraft specifications or combat tactics. It is a story about the collision between two visions of how wars are won. One vision prioritized martial valor, technical excellence in individual combat, the belief that courage and skill could triumph over material disadvantage. It was a worldview shaped by centuries of European military tradition, where elite formations of highly trained soldiers achieved decisive victories through superior fighting ability. The other vision prioritized industrial capacity, logistical depth, and the ability to project power across vast distances. It was a worldview shaped by the specific conditions of American geography and economy. A continent-sized nation with resources to spare, accustomed to solving problems through mass production and technological innovation rather than through the refinement of individual excellence. Neither vision was inherently superior in the abstract, but in the context of total war in the 20th century, one proved devastatingly more effective than the other. The P-51 was emblematic of this difference. It was not the best fighter aircraft of the war by every metric. The Focke-Wulf FDO-190D could match it in speed. The Supermarine Spitfire could match it in maneuverability. The German Me-262 jet exceeded it in both. But the Mustang could be where it needed to be, for as long as it needed to be there, in numbers that made resistance futile. And in strategic terms, presence and persistence mattered more than peak performance. This was the lesson that German pilots learned in the skies over their homeland between 1944 and 1945. Each sortie brought the same dispiriting confirmation. The Americans would return tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Their factories were untouched by bombs. Their training pipelines were full. Their fuel reserves were bottomless. They could afford to lose aircraft and pilots at rates that would cripple the Luftwaffe because they could replace losses faster than they accumulated them. War had become arithmetic, and Germany was on the wrong side of the equation. There is a museum in Ohio, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where a restored P-51D sits in a climate-controlled hangar. The aircraft is painted in the colors of the 357th Fighter Group, the checkered nose, and bright red trim gleaming under carefully positioned lights. Visitors can walk around it, can see the graceful lines of the laminar flow wing, the businesslike brutality of the 6.50 caliber machine guns, the cramped cockpit where a pilot sat for 6 or 7 hours at a stretch, alone in the frozen sky. There are always visitors. Children press their faces close to the plexiglass barriers, imagining themselves in the pilot's seat. Veterans shuffle past slowly, some of them remembering when these aircraft were not museum pieces but tools of war, as common and unremarkable as jeeps or mess kits. Historians take notes, photographers adjust their lenses, seeking the angle that will best capture the aesthetic of this machine. But it is difficult, looking at the polished metal and fresh paint, to reconstruct what it meant to see this aircraft appear in the sky over Germany in 1944. Difficult to understand the psychological weight of an engineering solution, the way a set of design specifications could represent the collapse of an entire worldview. The P-51 told the German pilots something they did not want to hear, that this war would not be decided by who had the bravest soldiers or the most skilled aviators. It would be decided by who had the industrial capacity to put more aircraft in the sky, more bombs on the target, more fuel in the tanks. It would be decided by an unsexy advantage in logistics and production, by the ability to manufacture drop tanks by the tens of thousands, by the willingness to let a fighter aircraft be good enough rather than perfect. In this sense, the shock that Franz Stigler and his comrades felt when they first encountered P-51 seconds deep over Germany was not simply tactical surprise. It was the shock of confronting an opponent who played by different rules, who had redefined what victory required, who had turned war into an industrial process as methodical and relentless as an assembly line. And perhaps this is the larger truth that the P-51 represents, not a truth about aviation or combat, but a truth about the nature of modern war itself. Wars are no longer won by heroes alone. They are won by supply chains, by research laboratories, by factory workers, and fuel depot managers and maintenance crews. They are won by nations that can absorb losses and continue producing, that can innovate faster than the enemy can adapt, that can project power not through brilliant strokes of genius, but through patient, grinding application of material superiority. This is not a romantic truth. It does not lend itself to epic poetry or stirring speeches. But it is the truth that defined the outcome of World War II, and the P-51 Mustang, sleek, deadly, and always there, was its most visible symbol. The German pilots who faced it learned this truth in the most visceral way possible, by watching their comrades die, by watching their fuel gauges drop toward empty, by watching the bomber streams continue day after day, despite everything they could do to stop them. By the time Franz Stigler landed his Bf 109 that day in January 1944, the war was not yet over. There would be 16 more months of fighting, millions more dead, entire cities reduced to ash. But in a cockpit 6 miles above frozen Thuringia, a German pilot had glimpsed the future and understood that it belonged to the nation that could put a fighter escort over Berlin. The mathematics had changed, and with them, history.